guys, welcome to the Conscious
What's
Endeavor.
good?
We are here once again in a little bit of a different space, switching it up, changing things around. So a little bit of a special episode today.
Yeah, we thought we would remind you that the world is yours.
Yeah, so key in on our good phrase over here, right? Everything encapsulated.
Yeah.
Right, so today I was thinking actually we talk a little bit about just in psychology, we have a definition of psychosis. We talk about the fact that there are people who are, have mental disorder, who are, crazy, insane, who have extrasensory perceptions, right? All sorts of different things, which psychology and psychiatric, people have trouble dealing with, have trouble to really, I think, as a culture,
Mhm.
in a way, we have trouble dealing with these things. How we mitigate those things a lot of times are pharmacological, right? We hit them in a chemical way
Mhm.
when rather than trying to address some of these maybe potential other issues that are leading into some of those things.
Mhm.
So I don't know if you want to weigh in. This
Yeah, I was
idea.
gonna say that, it's not just a Western philosophy about, psychosis. It's something that, it's in cultures throughout the world. We see this where they're like, oh shoot, pagal ho gaya is like a saying that they use like in India, like someone's gone crazy. And people sometimes don't slow down to see what's really going on with that person. That's why it is beautiful that we have science that teaches us a bit, but like you said, pharmacology comes in that. I think, it has a lot to also do with nutrition, cultural beliefs. Once you start believing something, you go down a pattern, you see a couple more things, and next thing you know, you're fully triggered. You're like, oh my God, I saw all these signs. And like, I think that has a lot to do with
Mhm.
what's being fed to somebody. So like, if you have someone who's in a neighborhood where everyone's superstitious,
Right.
they're more likely to go through that. And I see
Mhm.
that commonly. But it's not to say that one who's going through that cannot come out of it, because I think we've all had a little bit of battles with some type of psychosis or what we might call feeling like we're insane or going crazy. And,
Right.
it has a lot to do with the energies around us. It's not just like something from within. I think it's really what are you consuming with your eyes, your ears, your mouth,
Right. Yeah, I think there's like a kind of personal symbolism that each person has. If you're talking about superstition in that regard, it's like there's certain beliefs, there's certain associations that are kind of naturally made by the people around you, by your
Mhm.
family, whatever it comes from. And you kind of build this, framework that your mind then moves down, right?
Mhm.
And kind of feeds into what your stream of consciousness ends up being,
Mhm.
right? Because you have these patterns of association that are natural and in a way, biologically speaking, this is now the path of least resistance because these are connections that already exist in your brain, right? So now all of a sudden you're going to feed into a particular stream of consciousness, right? And it's going to put you down that particular road depending on what your family believes. And even adding to that, what I mean, when we have, I would say like certain episodes or whatever we want to call these in terms of mental disorders, delusions, anything like that. There's another counterpart which is really physiological. People becoming manic to some degree.
Mhm.
Manicness is a really big indicator to some degree. I mean, it's kind of I would say it's a mismanagement maybe of emotional energy, right? Or, the inability to control the energy. I
Mhm.
mean, if we talk about spiritual practice as well, dealing with energies and handling energies and transmuting energies is a really big part of just our psyche and our understanding, our control of this reality. And we can lose grip on that.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen people lose grip based off of things that are outside them, which is like wild. It's like when you hear people talk about, I can't believe this guy lost a fight. I can't believe this team lost. I can't believe this happened. Oh my God. Oh my God. That's on a very minor level, but
Right.
it's interesting to see how the humans will take that and m- internalize it and make it feel as if it has something to do with them and their world. Like, it's
Right.
really, it's amazing to me. That's why I think, it's key to dip into spiritual practices so you can balance yourself out. Because a lot of these things that we give value to do not truly matter to us, but we make it
Right.
matter.
Well, like that personal symbolism idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, like, for example, I'm from Detroit. I used to watch football all the time. The Lions have been historically horrible. And they're people who are diehard fans and they go with
Right.
that and it affects their psyche.
Yeah,
Yeah. It
100%.
makes
Like
them
the whole
feel,
city,
yeah. Yeah.
just
You feel like you're a loser. It's like,
yeah.
why and that to me is a form of psychosis, right? Because like
Mhm.
you're over here saying
Right.
something about yourself, putting yourself in a lower vibration, based off of something that is truly outside yourself.
You have no control over it either.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Right.
we see that a lot too. Like, when people like, it's like when you watch news and people talk about like, man, I can't believe this happened over there. Like, one, you don't know if it's true, and
Mm-hmm.
two,
Mm-hmm.
you're internalizing it. You're already taking this
Right.
information. Like, it's like I was talking about this to someone the other day. It's interesting how we know the lives of these celebrities and it somehow overtakes our lives. Like, how many times is Jennifer Lopez going to get married to somebody or engaged to somebody? You know what I'm
Or
saying?
divorced from
They're
somebody.
divorced from somebody. Like, they're like, oh, it's a perfect couple. And like,
Right,
like,
right.
come on.
And then the fact that they, get divorced later on, it's
Yeah.
like, oh, well, love isn't
Yeah,
real and blah,
well,
blah, blah. Now, all of a sudden, it's influencing that self narrative you have.
yeah.
You know what I mean? Like your ideals, like what you think love is, what you think, betrayal is, all
Yeah.
these different
What do you
things.
think a home is?
What do you think a man
Yeah.
is? You know what I mean? Like all these sorts of things, really weigh in. And it
Yeah.
is really interesting. I think a good word you used there was like internalized.
Mm,
You've internalized these things. And you're using these external reflections as, okay, this is the way the world is.
mm,
Right. And therefore, I'm going to now act and behave myself
mm.
in accordance with what I believe the world is externally.
Yes.
Right. And this is where I think in spiritual practice, we talk a lot about the mirror,
Mm,
right? That the what you see externally is like what you mirror internally. And also the changes you have internally
mm,
now will reflect a different external reality. Right. And this is also kind of maybe going into that idea of like manifestation and changing your reality and all those sorts of things, is that when you change your person
mm.
from the inside, all of a sudden now you're going to reflect different external ideals. You're going to find yourself not in accordance with people who have those other external ideals. You're going to find yourself like kind of, I think finding people who have similar, internal compasses,
Mhm.
right? And putting yourself on that wave.
I think that's something like when you look at just, we're talking about psychosis. It's interesting is like when you watch enough of things externally that don't have anything to do in your life, and you try to make that's your way of life. Like if you ask someone, what do they truly want? A lot of them will say, oh, I want this much money, or I want
Right.
this job, or I want this car. And then they realize like when they get it, it wasn't what they thought it was. You know what I'm
Right.
saying? And you
Right.
realize like that was something that you internalized based off of what you're seeing on TV. For instance,
Mhm.
like home improvements. Like there's all these shows that there's a wave of like, yo,
Yeah.
renovate your house, renovate your
Right.
house.
Get a new bathroom.
Yeah, get a new bath. Your kitchen, you need a backsplash. Like when I heard people talking about backsplash, I'm like, what? That's just something interesting. And what happens
Right.
with that is, I'm not saying that it's something bad to renovate your house. I think, hey, you should make your house as comfortable as can be. But what
Mhm.
I'm saying is when you internalize it and you don't have the means at the time to make that shift happen, and then you become in this like lower depressed state because you're going over people's houses
Right.
and they're like, oh shoot, their stuff looks great.
They
My
got a
stuff looks-"
backsplash. What do I have?
Yeah,
A
I'm saying, look at this,
backsplash?
right? And it's
Honey, did you see their backsplash?
like, oh my God, I don't know. Look, we need to renovate right now. Like
Right.
it's like that's something that can lead to you once again shifting to a lower vibration. When you're in these lower
Mhm.
vibrations, that's when these things happen that you can get a bit psychosis. You
Yeah.
can feel the world's against you. You can feel nothing's going your way.
Right.
When the truth is the world is actually happening for you, not to you.
I think there was one saying, and it says like comparison is the thief of joy,
Mm,
or something like that, right?
yeah.
Talking about that kind of, and it's weird too how suburbs are just built right one next to each other. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Or just like the means of comparison is immediate. It's like, what
Mm.
car are they driving? What are they doing this thing? But in terms of, I think in a way, just to echo this whole theme, is that there is kind of a collective psychosis going
Mm.
on. I mean, fed by materialism, fed by the kind of 9 to 5 mentality, and
Mm.
fed by this like, everyone does what they don't want to do.
Mm.
You know what I mean? How many of our parents, our previous generations, they just did what they did not want to do. They all found, this is the way it is. This is the way we have to do things.
Mm.
Things must be done this way. I think with the newer generations coming in, it's like, well, now we have more of a focus. It's like we have established infrastructure. Now we want to focus on sustaining that infrastructure. So we have sustainability. We have all these like larger ideas of, finding people in their passions, especially since everything is going to be run by robots at this point.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like we need to find ways in a way to adjust the society or just individuals to, kind of come in line with what's necessary or what the next step of, I guess, I would say civilization's
Mm.
evolution at this point could be. But
Yeah, I mean, it's a wake up call because like there's a lot of people, like I said, that have looked externally for what they believe brings them happiness, and what happens is I think when you're in a lower vibration, when you're feeling you're missing out on everything, you attract people like that. And then next
Right.
thing you know, your whole community, or the people you're hanging out with
Mhm.
are representations of the things that you believe you lack because they're all in that same mentality.
Yeah.
So it's really it can lead to psychosis. Like you can have a
Right.
group of people, you can have someone who's totally like what I would say aligned, but if they're surrounded by people who have fears, those fears can be pushed onto you, which leads to
Mhm.
what?
Mhm.
This false evidence appearing real, right? This
Yeah.
fear.
I mean, it's interesting too. You have people who like to complain or people who like to, all of a sudden when if you're like one of those people and then you start talking to someone and they start complaining, you're like, "Oh, I really relate to this
Mm.
person." Right? And now all of a sudden you now feed each other's delusions, right? And this, has again, I think really happened on a societal level in terms of like just the manicness of our society of like wake up with an alarm
Mm.
alarmingly
Mm.
just jolt your body out of sleep, right? Out
Mm.
of theta, right? Into
Mhm.
this, oh my God, panic mode, hit your adrenal glands, you know what I mean? Now force food down your face and drink an alkaloid, which
Mm.
like makes you all jittery, and then
Mm.
go into an office and sit under fluorescent lights and mess up your posture and stay there. And then there's toxic environments at that work environment. There's people who are angry and depressed, and they're just like throwing that energy all over the place.
Mm.
You know what I mean? And it's just, we all think that this is normal.
Yeah.
I would, just to echo that, it's like I'd love to just come back to the natural human condition.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? If we can, but
There's ways. I mean, I think if you look at these, companies that have a lot of employees, if they had programs that teach you, I know they do have emotional intelligence, but is it available to
Mhm.
everybody?
Right.
And I think, you know, an example is like when I was working in the corporate world, the common thing I would see is people would be talking about things outside themselves. Like I would hear like, groups of women talking about the Real Housewives of New Jersey. And then it's like you're talking about their life like it's your life. And then when are you really talking about your life? Because
Mhm.
you're at work from 9 to 5 and you have a mission there, whatever it is, to get done. So what ends up happening is you start internalizing everything around you. And once again, in a corporate environment, all you're taking in is what the corporation's feeding you, their way
Mhm.
of life, their
Mhm.
way of being. Plus, with what you just watched last night because you were too tired to do something in your creative space, you were watching TV, and you're watching TV, you're watching something that is being orchestrated for you to one capture your attention and capture your energy. Really, your attention is your energy. Where you direct your energy is where you direct your God. And if you're putting your God in something outside of you constantly, when are you really
Mhm.
coming back to self? And that is also, back to psychosis. Like you will see people die hard. Like, don't you ever talk about the New York Giants? Don't you ever talk about the Yankees?
Right.
Right. I'm sorry. Did the Yankees
Right.
pay your bills? Did the Yankees, and hey, I hope none of the
Mhm.
Steinbrenners or them are listening to this. But yo, honestly, sports are just the biggest way of consuming people's energy. Like
Mhm. Mhm.
you see, it's interesting too. Is like just to get into that is like people's salaries for what they do, and then we place a judgment on it, which I think is a form of psychosis. Like, why do you even care about that? Like, you're literally like anytime someone signs a contract, you know how much they're making. The first thing I hear people say is like, "Yo, I would do that for half that. I would play football for $1 million a year."
Right.
Where I'm like, dude, why do you even care? It's like it's not a thing for you to even it's something that you have a thought about that doesn't really even affect you in any single
Right.
way.
And it's
But
not a part of your life path. You're
yeah,
just kind of assimilating these random
yeah,
things.
like yo, I'll get in a boxing ring. Someone can knock me out for 5 million. I listen. I'm all right. No, thank you. I don't want to be knocked
I'll
out
get
by.
brain damage for that
Yeah,
amount of money.
yeah.
Like,
You know
yeah,
what I'm saying?
fine, totally.
Yeah, yo, shoot, I'll take a dive. You know what I'm saying? Not to say people don't take
Yeah.
dives, and that's another thing, right?
Right.
Like people get fixated on these outcomes. Back to just psychosis. What are you seeing is the common cause from the scientific world? Like, what's the breakdown of that?
Well, I think just to tie in some of the things we're talking about here is that the job of a psychologist really is to adjust the individual to the society,
Mm-hmm.
to make them a well-functioning individual in society,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if the society is maladjusted, the inherently the job of the psychologist is now also not suiting the individual because all it's doing is trying to get you to be a normal, healthy, functioning,
Mm-hmm.
working adult, right?
Yeah.
Which, I know there's a quote which says, there's no measure of health as you adjust to a sick society,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there are problems in that in and of itself. But um, if we really want to dive into a lot of what we have in terms of psychosis, so this is some of the things that I was thinking about, earlier today, which is that a lot of these things of parallels of spiritual awakening, they really do hit on things that technically would be considered psychosis,
Mm,
right? So now imagine, speaking, for example, shamanism, which has
mm,
existed in almost every culture ever
mm,
on the planet. Those people speak in tongues.
mm,
You know what I mean? They convulse. They do crazy things, quote
mm,
unquote. In our opinion, in our normal frame of mind.
mm,
So those people are going into these ecstatic states. They're seeing visuals. They're hallucinating,
mm,
right? They're going into these things which all for us would be, outside of the realm of normal sanity, right?
mm,
So, and even people like Carl Jung, comment and talk about some of these like Kundalini yoga practices and how they parallel
mm,
forms of psychosis,
mm,
and in which way do we really take this? Because in one regard, we could say one is self-induced
mm,
in terms of moving towards yoga and enlightenment. You're inducing these wild states, right?
mm,
The other one, psychosis, would be uncontrolled. And a lot of times in psychosis, we do tend to find brain abnormalities, right? Which would be
mm,
the really big thing that we touch on scientifically.
mm.
Again, most of those are chemically adjusted. Most of those are, addressed in those ways. Um,
There used to be a nail in the head they used to put in people's.
the lobotomy.
Yeah.
Right. So they
Yeah.
used to, back in the day, especially when people were particularly unruly in psych wards, they would do the lobotomy, which was literally an ice pick
Mm,
right up through the top of your eye,
mm,
right? Because it's a nice thin bone there,
mm,
and they would just scramble your brain. And some of these people who they did lobotomies to would end up being mutes
mm.
afterwards. They wouldn't speak. They wouldn't really control themselves. Some of them lost control of their bowels and their bladder. You know what I mean?
And this
It's
is going
they
on in the
were
60s in America,
yeah,
70s.
50, more like the 50s,
Okay.
I believe. Yeah, I think by the 60s we were done with that stuff. But it was a really bad medical practice, and something that like literally made people lose entire agency, an
Mm,
agency in the sense of like, them being self-directed.
mm,
So that was a horrible practice. And a lot of times, and again, in terms of how we deal with these things in the West, how we deal with these extrasensory perceptions, or how we deal with people having induced hallucinations, where is the source of those things? And I think that's the deeper issue, is to say that maybe, okay, maybe particularly it's a brain abnormality, but the question that science isn't asking is there an objective reality to these hallucinations, right? Where are
mm.
they induced from? How do they get induced? And
That's something to really ponder right there, because a lot of the things that we consider might be crazy for somebody. Like,
Mhm.
for instance, I when I was a child, I used to wear flip flops outside in the winter in Detroit, like with snow. Someone's like, "Oh, you're crazy. You're insane. Like, what's wrong with you?" I don't think there's anything wrong with me. It's just what I feel is fine with me, and it's just here we go. Society will look at it a certain way, like,
Mhm.
"Yo, you're not cold. You got flip flops on."
Right,
Like I don't look at it that way. But that's an example of
right,
what is the objective reality. These people here believe that that is crazy. Like, and it's a lot more than that. It's like, we start saying people are crazy based off of some of their cultural norms.
right.
And, they're
We might
like,
look at another culture, one culture to another culture. They may comparatively call themselves crazy. You
yeah.
know what I mean? So,
Yeah, we see that with like, you know, actually, I'll give you a prime example where I'm like, I'll talk about yoga to somebody, and not like I'm a yogi or something like that. Or, I am a yogi, but not in the physical form yet. But anyway, they'll talk about like, yeah, I can't do that. It's just it's wild to me. It's just a waste of
mhm,
time. It's this, it's that. So there's already this concept that has been, I mean, there's been something conceptualized about these practices that are used in the East or West. Like,
mhm.
even when you look at Buddhist monk, right? Not saying I want to live like that, but who are we to call them crazy? Like, them going in isolation. Or like, hey, you got people who move out of the city and they move to the middle of nowhere. Let's just say, I'm not saying Pennsylvania is all middle of nowhere, but let's say they moved to Pennsylvania
The
and they're,
Appalachia.
yeah, right. And they're like living on a mountain and whatever.
Yeah.
And we'll be like, oh, this person's crazy. They don't want to be in society. Well, maybe,
Mhm,
maybe they just don't want to be a part of this orchestrated,
mhm.
you know, yeah,
Yeah. And that individual
Mm.
might think the society's crazy.
Yeah.
So to find his or her sanity,
Mm.
they may leave that society.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And this is where a lot of it really ends up being interesting, because it's a lot of this just like subjective appraisal of what we think normal, quote unquote, normal behavior is, which normal does not exist,
Yeah.
right? Normal is a medium, right?
Mm.
So in between maybe, you know, how much water you drink and how much water I drink and how much water this person drinks,
Yeah.
that's the average
Mm.
amount of water consumed. That doesn't mean it's the appropriate, or maybe it's too much, maybe it's too little, right? But just the mean and the average has nothing to do with what is appropriate. I mean, for the organism, for the evolution, for all of those sorts of things.
This is part of
You
like
know?
the media generation though, right? Like, and it's also like when you look at like, oh shoot, yo, when someone comes from another country, they're like, oh, you know, thank God you made it out of Africa, or you made it out of, like, specifically, I'll give you an example. Someone's like, yo, you lived in Egypt for 2 years? Yeah, I did. What was that like? Are you okay? Are you like, what was wrong with you? Like, what do you mean, what's wrong with me? Like, it's like, people live there. People live in all parts of life. I'm not saying, you know, anything is less crazy than, like, you know, it's like someone going skydiving. You know, does he have psychosis? No. It's just what they feel called to do. It's not
Right.
like someone's going snowboarding, you know what I'm saying? Someone's going skiing, someone's going on skateboard, someone's going on roller
Yeah.
skates, a bicycle. You know, people are like, I have a friend, he has a car, but he always uses a bicycle. Like, yo, what's wrong with you? He just likes it. He likes using it. But here we are with the cultural norm of, like, you know, we live in a modern society now. I mean, now, of course, I'm sure back in the day, America, everyone had bikes, right? But then the cars came out and they got rid of the bikes weren't as much. But now you're seeing a big movement of, you know, conscious people wanting to utilize bikes that live in cities and stuff. So it's like, yeah, it's a normal thing. Like,
Less pollution, more exercise. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? I think that's pretty cool.
and they'll be like, oh man, I can't believe they're riding in New York City on these bicycles, man. They
Right.
piss me off so much. Well,
You're crazy.
yeah,
You're
they're
gonna get
crazy.
hit, you're gonna get hit by a car.
Yeah, you're wild. Like, you know, like,
Right.
and, you know, I think that's just really important to just, and we've touched on this a lot. Like, what are we consuming? What are we putting into our mind? What are we internalizing?
Mhm.
You know, like rock star, you know, like, oh man, it's like, what is a rock star? And then like people like, I want to be a rock star. So that means, because of the definition that people have made about a rock star, it's not that you want to create beautiful music and, you know, uplift humanity. What you want to do is you want to party like a rock star, which means you're sex, drugs, and coke. I mean, sorry, not sex, drugs, and coke, right? Sex, drugs, and women, or I don't know if women go like men, you know, but it's like that's what their form of life is, and or what they see as something that to inspire to. And that might be crazy to somebody else. It means that you want to spend your whole time.
I mean, a lot of the parallels with musicians, there's a lot of like destructive behavior behind it. I mean, the thing about art and music, and I don't want to touch on this just for a minute because we can do a whole episode on this stuff. But you know, I think a lot of people who have insightful works of art are people who have been through trauma, who have been through troubles, and they write about it. I mean, if we look at the history of blues music, right, it's all about people talking about like what ails them and like what they're going through. And those people pour their heart and soul into the music, right? But then, and as a method of coping, but then there are other methods of coping, right? Being dissociation and denial, and drugs are a perfect way to dissociate. You know what I mean? Like partying is a perfect way to get your mind away from what you're studying. Or what you're going through, you know. So there is a tendency, I feel like, especially with the availability of those things. I mean, if you're a musician, you're naturally a part of the nightlife, and people in the nightlife naturally associate with those other things. So there's a lot of things that happen there, and those people can go into a form of psychosis. I think drug-induced psychosis, things to the fact that you're just, you know, turning your mind off most of the time, dissociating. You're going to lose control of yourself, right? But again, like just echoing this theme here, right? So the control of the self, right? Whether or not that is self-induced, whether we lose control, whether we kind of push our limits to the point where our control fades away, right? So again, just echoing this idea of the parallels here between enlightenment or spiritual practice and psychosis, right? Because again, our society as a whole doesn't know how to deal with particular perceptions. We don't really know how to handle someone who says they see. I mean, and interesting in religious circles, if someone says, "Well, I see God," they might uplift that person. You know, prior to the paradigm of religion, someone says, "Oh, I see some guy and or some lady or some entity, and it's talking to me and it's telling me things and blah blah blah." It's like, okay, well, insanity, right? And it's weird that certain circles, these narratives are accepted, right? In religious circles, people are naturally speaking in tongues, and if you did that at work. Right, if you went to your 9 to 5 and you were like, I feel God, you know what I mean? Wow, well, we're going to put you in a straitjacket now, right? But if you did that at church, right, now it's so suddenly appropriate. So the context of these things is really, really interesting.
It's funny you brought up that example. I'm like, you can go to work and start busting jokes out and people will think you're crazy. Like, hey, why are you making a joke? You know what I'm saying? Like, they'll think something's wrong with you. Like, if you're like the social one at work.
Right.
Like, and that's really interesting to me is like, because you don't obey the structure of what people consider to be the way of behaving at work, that means that there's something wrong with you. Like, yo, I think he's a little crazy. You know what I'm saying? He's always laughing. He's always joking. He's always smiling. And, that's interesting. I mean, you talk about extreme with seeing God, I don't even know if you can bring up God at a workplace nowadays. You know what I'm saying? I don't think you talk about, the good or what, the most high at work. They're like, it's always something scripted. Like even when you work at these organizations,
it's like the most high. Did you do the balance sheet? Like,
yeah, he ain't paying the bills, right? She ain't paying the bills. And I just want to like bring back like when we talk about psychosis, we talk about what that is. I know that there are people that see things. There are people that can be bipolar, and there's spiritual education about this out there, spiritual knowledge that people say, like if someone's bipolar, it might mean that they're experiencing life in two different dimensions. There's a lot of methodology behind it, and depending on where you go, you can get different answers. It's not to say any of them are wrong, because the human is so amazing that with the right support, with the right knowledge or tapping into yourself, you're able to resolve these issues. Some of these psychosis, when we talk about psychosis to extreme, where you see someone who might be what you call truly delusional, or they're like just frantic and whatnot, it could be a lot of things. And sometimes it's drugs related, or I would say like medicines that, pharmaceuticals that can cause that. Because we have pharmaceutical meds that do literally tell you that you might experience thoughts of suicide, you might experience, like, and that's like wild to me. It's like, hey, you know what? I don't think anything's really worth the risk of wanting to commit suicide. I don't want to go into that, but that's something that people accept because we see the commercials for, at least here
it's kind of in terms, it's like the lesser evil. You know what I mean? It's like, well, I'm depressed and I can't move and I can't do this, but I'd rather like be able to move and then maybe think about, It's hard. I think people have a real struggle, and you also have to think to what point they need to get to in order to try to use that as a solution. I think a very common response from trauma is a lot of these developments of psychosis. So, for example, like borderline personality disorder is often diagnosed after someone has a traumatic experience. And it's really the fact that the trauma in and of itself has fractured their psyche, right? If they had naturally dissociated to initially to get away from the experience in their mind, right? They've fractured off that perception, that memory, and now all of a sudden, now we have, if we look at that biologically, now we have two divergent neural networks, right? If we're literally trying to not think about it, we are literally parsing those things. Again, the brain working in association, neural networks are going to be created. Neurons are going to connect to each other. When we try to dissociate, by analogy, we're really like, disconnecting these neural networks, and now we have two different branches, and now we can think about how things like multiple personality and all these sorts of things come about, right? Because now we have different, neurological patterns which are popping off and all dissociated, not integrating with one another. And a big practice in spirituality is that practice of integration.
And that's where like, the breath, breath work comes in, and, ensuring that you're taking things in your body that assist with this neuron network in your brain. And I'm not that this is just putting it out there. Like, so if someone has this multiple personality disorder and their neural networks have separated, the idea would be to remedy that is to bring it back to one whole, but that would require a lot of integration, a lot of...
Right. The interesting thing, too, is in terms of our psychological, psychiatric, and medical paradigms, we look at these things biologically, right? So if I want to reintegrate a neural network, there's really no way I mean, maybe chemically, there's certain, drugs that could help people, kind of do this, but really, self-integration is a hugely psychological process, and it requires extremely deep work.
Mhm.
And a lot of times, what cures in terms of the psyche, what's going to help the individual reintegrate is actually dealing with those traumas that are deeper.
Mm.
So it goes into, as what we would say in spiritual world, is shadow work, and all these things that we're denying about ourselves, denying about our self experiencing, not looking into particular aspects of our life path that have hit us,
Mm.
right? And getting into those things is very, very dangerous and trauma inducing, because it comes from trauma
Mm.
initially, right? So it's really, really deep work, and it's dangerous.
Mm.
But this is also like the work that we would say of the shaman, of the practitioner, that, you're in the woods and you're screaming your head off and you're doing, all these, wild things. But it's a part of coming back to what happened before the incursion of these things.
Yeah, I like how you brought up the woods, and people talk about like I need to go to a jungle to experience plant medicine, or for this healing because it's a healing, right? Like the
Mhm.
this, and I think it's important. The reason why these locations are so pivotal in that I know you can do healing anywhere. You could do it at home. You could do healing wherever you are, whether you're driving, whether you're sitting down in a forest, in a park, at home. It's just about having a space where you're in what I would say your own energy, and you're being honest with yourself and being authentic with yourself. But the reason why these woods and these jungles matter is they carry vibrations of natural nature, because we've been so pulled away from nature itself. Like, you know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? Especially here, at least on the East Coast, I'll say, because like the West Coast is completely different. I know the South is different, but like over here, we're in a fast paced life. We're being constantly bombarded with energy, and everything happens so quickly here. I've had a job in the South where like, man, deadlines don't matter. In the East, you have deadlines that don't make sense. It's like that was due yesterday. And what
Right.
that does is it puts this added pressure onto you, which somehow you still internalize. Because if you're working one of these jobs that
Mhm.
has these deadlines, and you're working with all these people that are all frantic, you're taking on that energy.
Right.
So when you go to the jungle, when you go into nature, you're essentially going back to where things are naturally the way they're meant to be. And they're never, I don't care where you
Yeah.
go, they're never this fast paced unless you're
Right.
in a jungle packed with some animals that are coming after you, which is,
Right.
not really the case.
And even then, that fast pace, thing is maybe a couple minutes in
Yeah.
duration of you just booking it up a tree.
Mm.
You know what I mean? And then the moment passes. The thing, I think, also the problem with a lot of modern society, especially East Coast, is like we have this chronic stress condition. You know what I
Mm.
mean? We have chronically under stress, and even when we leave work, we're thinking about the deadlines that we're under. We're
Mm.
thinking about all of the other things. And the interesting thing is our biology does morph to suit what our mind is doing,
Mm.
right? So after all of these inducing stress moments, right, of dealing with coworkers, having these sorts of deadlines, dealing with a high workload,
Mm.
right, maybe even being understaffed at the same time,
Mm.
we internalize these stress things, and all of a sudden now our adrenal glands are being emptied, right? So the point where, like, when we're in at work, we're in a high adrenaline state, and
Mm.
then you leave work and you're like, okay, I can kind of relax, but now all of a sudden your adrenal glands are depleted,
Mm.
right? Your nervous system is fried, right? All of a sudden now, and this is in a way, I'm thinking even about now the biology of bipolarness, because
Mm.
bipolar would be being manic and then being depressive,
Mm.
right? You're manic when you're at work, you go home and you're in a vegetative state. You
Mm.
sit in front of a television, you eat some food, you go into a
Mm.
food coma, as we like to say,
Yeah.
right? You know what I mean? So in a way, are the patterns in society inducing similar symptoms
Mhm.
of some of these states of psychosis? It's really interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting is like for me when I see it, aside from like a physical issue that might be occurring in the brain, when I see it amongst like people being depressed, because to me that is like a form of, and that's just me saying it, he's a scientist, not me, the diagnosis, right? Like, because like why do people get depressed? And on average, when I start seeing why people are depressed is because they've internalized a system of value that is not their true value.
Right. The productivity
Mm.
mindset too. It's like if you're not being productive,
Mhm.
you're now worthless.
And then
Right.
productive is something that they
Right.
compare usually. It's like, oh, I'm not as
100%.
productive as my sister or my
Right.
brother or my cousin
Yeah.
or my neighbor. And then what happens is you end up putting yourself in a lower vibration. And then there's things that we start seeing outside ourselves. And I'm gonna bring this up because these are things I've gone through, right? Like I grew up in Detroit, and like, I never felt like I fit in, or I did feel like I fit in, but then like when I would go meet other people who lived in the burbs, I felt a certain way because I'm from, an urban area. And then on top of that, I didn't have the fashion, you know what I'm saying? I didn't have the wealth or what other people were seeing on TV as being something like dope. In fact, there's some styles when I was a kid, like I wish I wanted them then, but I'm looking back, I'm like, I'm glad I didn't have them because I really didn't vibe with them. But those are things that are being fed to you. And it's like, I don't look this way. I don't talk this way. I don't walk this way. And then what ends up happening is you start feeling like there's something wrong with you because when you try to do these other things or wear these other things, you don't even feel that vibration. And that's a form of psychosis to me. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's an evaluative thought process that goes on, and there's kind of these cyclical thought patterns of self-evaluation that a lot of people, I'm not living up to these standards, these ideals, which a lot of times are not created by you. They're societal ideals, these other things. And again, as we internalize those things, right, we now have this means of comparison internally. Right. And then all of a sudden now we have this internal mechanism that allows us to bounce back and forth. And as we said before, that comparison is the thief of joy. Right. So what's the opposite of joy? Would be that depressive state. So if we're internalizing these thought structures, internalizing these external ideals, which are not really, really based in reality, I would say they're very cultural, because if you go to another culture, right, you'd have a whole different set of ideals of what you would strive for, what you want to wear or look like or sound like becomes completely different. Something really interesting with depression as well is that there's been studies done with placebo effects. So in terms of the placebo, we actually have 50% of people who are in the placebo group for depression get out of depression.
Wow.
Right. So normally the paradigm for studying these things, right, is, we have 50-50, right? So we have, okay, we're going to take a group, right? We're going to test how this drug works, what the efficacy of this drug is. And we're going to say, okay, we have half and half. So half of these people are going to get the drug. The other people aren't going to get the drug. And what we should see, right, naturally is the people who have the drug, right, will be way more improved than the people who don't.
Yeah.
Right. The people who don't is the placebo group. We're just giving them a sugar pill. Right. But what actually happens is actually 50% of the people in the placebo group actually end up getting better, right? So what does this say about the nature of depression, right? The nature of these depressive thought things. If now all of a sudden I'm not getting treatment, but I believe I'm getting treatment. So you're telling yourself, oh, I'm getting better. I'm in a doctor's office, which is a form of unconscious psychosocial support, right? You know what I mean? And now all of a sudden we feel lifted. We feel like we're getting better, or I'm doing something about this. Also, a big thing that comes with depression is this sense of helplessness. I'm worthless, and I can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
Right? A lot of times people get worthless, but then they get motivated. They're like, well, you know what? I'm going to make myself worth something. And then they can get out of that naturally. So it's kind of a pairing of those things. But all of a sudden, when we have these kind of conditions, when there's placebo conditions, people now think I'm doing something about it. I'm making myself better. I'm getting treatment. And now all of a sudden, that little bit of a boost allows them to literally pick themselves up out of their bootstraps, right? Even though they don't know that it's all them, right? Because a lot of times there's internalized thing of like, I can't do it myself.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that's also plays a big role into how these disorders kind of pick up and manifest. But
that is why it's so pivotal, I feel, to put yourself in different environments when you're feeling depressed. Maybe get out of the normal circles you're in. Maybe go do something new. Maybe, obviously, I know going in the sun is vital. You know what I'm saying? Like we talk about vitamin D and, how people who live near the equator they don't go through depression as much as people who live like, in the north. And it's vital for us. And back to that 9-to-5 schedule, you're not getting the sun. You're not taking time to get out of the sun. You're, as you highlighted, you're in this corporate building with these fluorescent lights all day. And what else is like that? Insane asylums. You know what I'm saying? Like when they already talk about institutionalized, right? Like, that's an institution. When you're in a building that looks like that, and then, oh man, I'm just gonna go down this path. Yeah.
I mean, the crazy part too is like, you look at like, how a prison is run. It's like, you only have a certain allotted time of where you're allowed to go outside on the yard. Yeah. Right. And where else do you see that?
Recess.
Right, exactly. Schoolyard. You know what I mean? Like, you can't do what you want. You have to ask to go to the bathroom. You know
You're
what I
being
mean?
watched the whole
You have
time.
zero autonomy, and then you get to go out in the yard for a little bit, and then you got to come back and do,
Run some
whatever.
laps. You know what I'm saying? Like, now we're gonna teach you the history that we know is not real. But let me stop. Another thing was, when you're in these depressed states for a while, a long, let's just say
Mhm.
a while,
Mhm.
it then does have a neurological effect on your brain.
100%.
Yeah. And
Right.
that's wild. So if you have somebody who's facing depression, let's talk about the sun. Let's talk about meditation. Let's talk about not consuming drugs. Let's talk about not consuming alcohol. You know what I'm saying? Because
Right.
if you really think about it, the majority, at least in my experience, the majority of fights I've ever seen outside of the ring
Mhm.
have to do with alcohol. They have to do with some sort of substances being put in somebody's body, which causes I don't want to say, mass psychosis. Like if you got a bunch of people who are consuming alcohol, what do we think is going to happen? It creates that toxicity. It affects you. It brings your vibration down.
It
And
literally
ultimately,
shuts down your frontal lobe partially.
wow, that's why
Yeah.
people black out. Or what is that?
Yeah. I mean, well, alcohol in and of itself literally stops the frontal lobe from functioning. It literally shuts it down partially. And this is why people feel disinhibited, right? Because normally when you have a crazy thought, my crazy thought is like, I'm going to jump on the table and punch that guy in the face and then kiss that girl and then do that and then jump and then run around the block.
Sounds like experience.
You know what I mean? But what your frontal lobe does is your frontal lobe practices inhibition. Your frontal lobe says, well, no, maybe in this context we shouldn't do that, and that wouldn't be a good idea because there's consequences to that, right? So your frontal lobe is doing this kind of cause and effect benefit analysis, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That shuts off when you
Wow.
drink alcohol.
Wow.
So that's why normally a lot of these impulses you have, right, just come right out because the part of your brain that's doing that disinhibition does not operate.
It makes a lot of sense why you see a lot of these things happen,
Yeah.
like car accidents from drunk driving, fighting. Listen, I know humans are amazing and we can transmute almost anything, but when you're putting poison in your body, it has an effect on you, and you are what
Yeah.
you eat. So some of the psychosis, like, what are you eating? They talk about parasites in foods, like, that's another thing that no one really addresses in our, I don't want to say scientific, in the scientific community, because they do, but I think when you go to the medical community, they're more trained on how to address things from a medication cause effect
Well,
instead of
symptom mitigation,
Yeah.
right? You know what I mean? It's like, okay, well, you're having these problems. Maybe, you're eating poorly. Maybe you have a lack of magnesium in your body, or maybe you're eating things that are minerally deficient, and all of a sudden now your joints hurt,
Yeah.
right? Or and now all of a sudden, well, like they're going to say, oh, well, we're going to give you a painkiller
Yeah.
to deal with the joint pain. And not actually talk about the root cause of the mineral deficiency, which is causing that pain, right? You can take a supplement of magnesium or whatever you may need, particularly. You can do those mineral intakes, and I encourage everybody who's watching to do these mineral intakes because, again, it'll tell you what your body is deficient in, what you need, and then you can just take supplements and then all of a sudden just balance out the chart, you know what I mean? And now you're going to have a good health profile. There's ways of doing that, you know what I mean? It costs like $150 and you can get a whole profile, blood work done, and you can actually find out what minerals you have, what minerals you don't, and that can get you back into a thing. And again, because our medical and psychological communities, because our main paradigm we operate in is this, this way, this biological paradigm, a lot of times we look at certain, forms of psychosis or forms of, like, let's say, mental unease, like depression, for example. We look at it biologically. So a lot of people who have depression say, well, it's not my fault. It's because I have an imbalance in my brain. Right. Well, a lot of these things naturally are simultaneously occurring. Right. As you said, once depression becomes chronic, it becomes habitual.
Yeah.
Right. Now your brain is going to habituate. It takes about, as they say, 21 days for a habit to form. If you've been, depressed for 6 months, your brain has now fundamentally changed. But what induced that depression initially can a lot of times, and most of the times, is environmental. And we see that with the fact that placebo effects work on depression pretty significantly. Right. And now it's all to say that, a lot of these things are simultaneous, right? The environment you're in is not suiting you. You live with a lack of purpose. Maybe you have trouble with particular relationships in your life. That's going to affect the way that your brain operates, right? We know, for example, if you have a reward in life, just in general, dopamine is released, right? If you do a cold exposure, norepinephrine, adrenaline, all these things that would actually get you up out of your seat, are now released, right? People who are lethargic and sit back, they have a lack of adrenaline, right? But if you start doing cold exposures, dopamine, norepinephrine, all these adrenaline responses up 300% in the body, right? So what is mood? If you want to say, well, there's an imbalance in the chemicals in my body, well, there's literally physical behaviors you can do that will then induce changes in the physiology, right? Which then can change that paradigm.
Is thinking considered a physical?
Yeah.
So it's a physical.
100%. Well, you have to understand that thinking is, again, synonymous with neurological activation, neural network activation. So if I'm thinking about, for example, right now I'm thinking in words, I'm speaking words, my Broca's area in my left hemisphere is highly active, right? Because it's literally localized to a particular area. If I start thinking about autobiographical memory, if I start thinking about things, my precuneus is going to be activated. If I specifically move the middle index finger in my right hand, the left somatosensory cortex will activate, it will fire. There's electrical activity. So every thought, every emotion, every behavior, everything is coincided with an electrical activity in a particular spot in the brain.
Wow, it sounds like you just dropped a bunch of remedies for people to understand. One, how we can treat depression, how we can enhance our lives, how we can connect with our true selves, how we can understand ourselves better, and how the brain functions. And thoughts being something that's a physical thing, it's important to circle back to, what are you thinking? Why are you thinking what you're thinking? And if you can really put some energy, that's why affirmations, they're effective.
100%.
Yeah. And then you brought the placebo effect. Placebo effect is really you thinking. It's like, it's you thinking what is going on. So you are what you think. You are what you eat. So it's really, it's just really coming to center and trying to understand, take control of it. Look into what it is. Like, for instance, what is a chicken known for, right? It's always on the run. Chicken is always on the run. It's always going somewhere. It's always going left, right, whatever, up, down. It's you trying to catch a chicken. People can catch a chicken, but the chicken essentially is spending its whole life like on the run, you know? And that's why chickens, when you eat it, you know, people become fearful. I see that. I believe that. I know that it's like you are what you eat. So like that's why there is this big movement about people eating plants. Plants are chill. They grow from the earth. They have minerals. They have these nutrients, and they're vital for us. But you know, sometimes we start eating things that, like, I don't know what a pig's known for, but I don't think a pig's known for anything like I want to adapt in my life. Now, maybe warthogs are powerful. I get it, but I'm not going to be eating a warthog. But you know, these things are the things that you're consuming that have, I'll say they'll have some sort of parasitic effect, like even salmon, sushi, whatever, right? You're taking these things, and you're eating it raw, and then you're putting soy sauce on it, which soy is another thing. I can keep going down this. My whole thing is take initiative, guys. Think about what you're eating. Think about what you're consuming. Think about what your thoughts are. Are they real? Are you really saying to yourself that I'm not worthy unless I go get this Ferrari, or I'm not worthy if I don't get this designer this, or if I don't get this, ladies, if I don't get this purse? And then if you get purses too, because that's a thing now too. I don't know. But, you know, these are things that like people start associating value, self-value to. Like if I get this, I'm better somehow. Oh, yo, I got this watch, right?
Yeah.
And in a day, like you came in this world with nothing. You came in this world butt naked. And, you know, you're going to, when you go, it don't matter how many rollies they're going to bury you with. It doesn't have that effect. I'm not saying rollies aren't nice or anything like that, guys. I'm just saying like our value should be based off of our thoughts. It should be like, what am I feeling? What am I doing what I want to do? Am I in charge of my life? Because everyone has the ability to be in charge of their life, regardless of their circumstance. Everything anyone's going through, it's because of your own doing, and what you can do is come out of it by tapping in with yourself. Get into that meditative state. Get into that. Take a cold plunge. Cold plunges are amazing. You know, get some sun. I know maybe it's winter right now, less sun for people. Figure out a way to get some sun. When it's out, take initiative. It'll only benefit you.
Yeah, I definitely think there's natural remedies to a lot of things. I think a lot of times just literally good sleep, hydration, sunlight, good food, like raw food, you know what I mean? A lot of those things are just really good natural remedies. Having good relationships as well, because humans are social animals. So social support systems are really, really important for our overall health. There's, again, studies done with social support. The people who were, you know, had surgeries, you know, they would take a pool of people who all had the same type of surgery, and they'd look at the survival rate. And the people who had social support had a much higher degree of survival for that people who didn't have social support. So having something to live for, right? Someone to live with, right, is incredibly important unconsciously to the survival of our own personal psyche.
Mm.
I think it's really also, as we're talking about like these thought processes, it's really um, interesting to think about the thought or the mind in a way as an electrical storm,
Mm.
right? The brain is literally, neurons are literally electrically firing, right?
Mm.
So the pace at which we have brain waves, we talk about brain waves, in the scientific community, and it's really the speed of thought processes.
Mm.
So if we think about your brain in a way like an electrical storm, we have this idea that you can have a roaring, thunderous electrical storm in your brain, and sometimes maybe we lose control of that. We forget how to control that.
Mm.
You know what I mean? And one of the best ways, I think, in a meditative sense, is just to listen. Listen and don't react to the storm, right? I mean, that's one of the biggest things as they talk about in Zen practices is non-reactivity, right? Just like kind of stepping in, listening to what you're feeling, listening to what your mind is doing, and letting it pass, right? And in that regard, if you listen to this activity, and what happens a lot of times with most people is we hear this activity and then we go, oh my God,
Yeah.
that's activity. And then we add to the storm, right? Because we keep we react to what's already occurring.
Mm.
And I think allowing ourselves to settle, just in terms of our general psyche and our psychosis as we bring this, kind of into, a close here, but like thinking about how we bring down the storm, using non-reactivity, having the storm, listening to the storm, understanding that it's a part of us, it's a part of where we come from, it's a part of where we've been, right? But
Yeah.
now if we want to be consciously self-directive, where we've been has nothing to do with where we go
Yeah.
because we can turn, right? And how do you turn a car? If you want to turn right, you can't do it at 90 miles an hour.
Right.
You have to slow down in order to change direction. You got to go slow down to 25 or 15 in order to make that right turn,
Yeah.
right? So slowing down your process, slowing down yourself, getting into that process of non-reactivity, compassionately listening and holding that kind of space for yourself is incredibly important for you to be more evaluative, to come into a space where, we're open to ourselves, we're open to direction and change. And those are a lot of the things that we want to inspire, especially if we're in depressive states, if we're in manic states.
Mm.
We want to change. We want to do those things. So,
I think it's really important what you highlighted about, so it's like the brain goes, the thoughts go like 1,000 miles per second, or that's how quickly
Mhm.
once you get down like a
right.
negative pattern, you could spiral out of control. That's why they say like when you're about to react to somebody or if you're gonna respond to someone, take a breath, slow down, a slow inhale, long exhale, just to center yourself, because your our brains are amazing and we appreciate that about it. Like when you have an amazing thought or a magical thought or a magnificent thought, you can go 1,000,000 miles per hour with that, and it's going to take you down developing, creating, manifesting. Now, if you're having a negative thought, it can do the same thing, and that's why you got to be really centering. You got to center yourself, and you got to, like you said, observe, be quiet, like just let
Mhm.
the thoughts flow, see what it is, see if you really want to step into it. And if it's not, how do you get out of that? That's where the meditative state's so essential. You brought up something else about like, good support systems. It's
Right.
also important to evaluate your support
Yeah.
system. Like if you like, look, I can't stand my mother, this isn't that, whatever, then why are you incorporating her in your day to day multiple times throughout a day? Give her a call once in a while. Take your energy back from those people that are bringing you to a lower vibration. I'm not saying everyone is to blame for why you feel the way you feel, because ultimately there's some accountability that is on you, and once you take that accountability for yourself, these other external factors, they will disappear out of your life, or they will shift. But it's important for you to
Mhm.
shift yourself first. So get out of that situation. You can find a good support system, but it starts with
Mhm.
you loving yourself, giving energy to yourself, and taking control of yourself by nutrition, habits, thoughts, whatever you're eating, right? Like,
I think it's really interesting too if you come into that space. Like again, yeah, we do want to kind of protect our energy as we speak, from maybe particular individuals. But it's interesting too if we come down to that internal space within ourselves,
mm,
how we reflect with that individual now has changed because we
mm,
have changed ourselves. So now all of a sudden, maybe there's a crazy back and forth between you and your mother in this example you're talking about. But now because you've internally changed, maybe she throws something at you and you don't react to it
yes,
and you don't throw it back to her, right?
yes,
So now all of a sudden, it's now she's maybe throwing things your direction. And if you're not throwing it back,
mm,
she's going to tire out.
yeah,
right? Because, and this is why I think they talk about the analogy all the time of like, don't fight fire with fire,
Yeah.
right? Because when someone throws something about you, you throw it back, and now all of a sudden you're both just feeding the same flame. But you know,
Inferno.
right? So if someone throws fire at you, you give them water,
Yeah. Like that.
and now you're just in the middle. Both of you are just, you know, kind of, oh, okay, well now we're neutralized.
Mhm.
You know, and now all of a sudden, both of you kind of have this conscious appraisal that you can go through, and you can kind of change and transmute the relationship you have with other individuals by kind of looking at it in an alchemical sense, right? I mean, the whole basis of transmutation and all these sorts of things, alchemy, really comes down to these elemental practices of thinking and thinking of, like, when I'm angry, I'm fiery. When I'm flexible, I'm watery, right? When I'm spontaneous, I'm going with the air, right? And we all know about being grounded, right? So really thinking about those things elementally is really interesting, and it helps in terms of thought process, maybe even your personal thought process. You can think about which one of those four elements do you resonate with, and then which elements do you think you should bring in, right?
I love that right there. That is vital information. That's beautifully put. You know, like, I'm a fan over here, guys. That's shifting reality. You know, utilizing that methodology right there will assist people greatly in shifting through whatever they're facing in their lives. And, you know, this is a conscious endeavor.
Most definitely. So yeah, join us next week, guys. Check those links in the description. Subscribe to see the next episode. We're gonna keep this rolling, keep this running. I hope you guys like our new room. You know what I mean? We'll be back and forth all over the place, but always trying to throw things, new things at you guys. So check those links in the description. Myself, Self-Perpetual. We got Timeless Tayeb here. Check into some of the workshops that I'm doing. All those sorts of things. You can always check in with some spiritual coaching from Timeless Tayeb over here. So check those links in the description. Stay subscribed, and we'll see you guys next week.
Gratitude.